magazine. As we embark on this journey of .ed magazine, we invite you to immerse in a rich tapestry of ideas and insights that reflect the collective commitment to transforming education for the betterment of humanity. .ed is a quarterly magazine published by the Global Citizenship Foundation, aimed at catalyzing positive changes in education for human flourishing. It serves as a community of practice and a platform for educators and thought leaders to engage in discussions, innovation, and reflection on transforming education globally. Each edition of the .ed magazine features contributions from experts and leaders worldwide, addressing carefully selected themes that prompt introspection and advocate for necessary changes. The magazine also emphasized the importance of global citizenship education, seeking to foster a sustainable and inclusive future while encouraging collective responsibility for its impact and longevity. Lastly, the goal of Media Magazine is to take the first step toward mobilizing the Global Citizenship Education Initiative, advancing transformative education, and contributing to the realization for a better world. Now we will have Jihad to introduce more about the fourth edition of .ed magazine.
Jihad, can you unmute, please?
Sorry. So, good afternoon, everyone. And for this first edition, the title of the magazine is Fostering Educational Leadership and Management. It explores the diverse aspects of impactful educational leadership, advocating for qualities such as self-awareness, resilience, and the reflection of personal values. The edition also scrutinized leadership that emphasizes creativity, aiming to prepare learners for their chosen career path. It dives into broader policy measures to address the challenge of online learning for school leaders, discussing distributive reforms to an innovative solution aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. Besides that, the concluding call to action encourages a collective journey towards excellence and equity in education, positioning education leadership as a transformative force for human and planetary flourishing. I would like to introduce Dr. Maria Guajardo. Today, she will graciously deliver the opening addressing. She's a luminary in the field of international labor arts and leadership studies at Soka University, Japan. Brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise to our events. Her dedicated research and publication have significantly contributed to understanding of critical aspects such as women leadership, pedagogy, and the impact of globalization in higher education. We are confident that her address will set the stage for an amazing launch event. Please join me in giving her the most heartfelt welcome. The stage is yours, Professor Maria.
Jihad, thank you so much for those opening words. And Yang, thank you as well. Thank you so much for making this all possible. I am very pleased to be with you here. It is 8 p.m. in Tokyo, Japan, and our panelists come from around the world. And they're up at 3 in the morning, and it's even later than 8 p.m. in Australia. So we are very, very committed, dedicated, and excited to be with you. I am very pleased to be moderating this panel on educational leadership and management. It's the fourth edition, as you heard, and really beginning to, I think, challenge us to think about what are the opportunities and what are the obstacles in moving forward as we begin to think about the future, the ever-present future of education. And so with that, I would like to be able to just share some thoughts with you. as I was thinking about what would I like to be able to share with you, I realized that when we think of educational leadership, it is those challenges and opportunities. The challenges that came from COVID, while the pandemic's restrictions are pretty much non-existent now, there is still that sense of how do we go back to normal? How do we go back to understanding what were the benefits that came out of the pandemic, and how can we enlist that new knowledge and apply it to how we move forward? As part of that new knowledge, we embraced technology in a way that we had never done before. It challenged many of us to question, how can student engagement happen on a screen? How do we pay attention to the diverse student population that we're working with, whether it's K-12 or in higher education? And how do we then also begin to understand what's around the corner? I don't think there is a normal to go back to. I think our job is to begin to relearn, unlearn, and perhaps learn a new way of approaching our work. When I think about leadership as a leadership scholar, I have grappled with, is it a practice? Is it a position? Is it a list of characteristics? And specifically in the field of education, how can we begin to understand leadership? One of my favorite definitions of leadership comes from the scholar Peter Senge, and he defined leadership as the capacity of a human community to shape the future. And when I think about educators, K-12, higher ed, lifelong educators, when I think about the work that we are all engaged in, I would suggest that we are in the process of connecting with the human community. And through our work and through our relationships with those young learners, we are in fact shaping the future. So, as these educational change agents, how can we begin to participate in shaping that pathway of education, an enterprise that will shape not only our local communities, but also shape the planet? And this work will, in fact, require a community. I know that there has often been tension between practice and theory. How do we begin to apply what we've learned? And in this application, how do we look towards the future? In 2021, 2 years ago, UNESCO published the Futures Report, and it presented a case for a new social contract for education to address future needs. In a future radically disrupted by the pandemic, this report was promising in terms of shifting the focus at various levels of the educational enterprise, assuring the right of education and designing education as a collaborative endeavor for the common good. The Futures Report itself presents a North Star for many of us. It's a North Star for transforming education, and whether we take the Futures Report as that North Star, or whether you've been able to imagine and co-create your North Star, the question is, what change agents will be required to move us forward? One of my favorite educators is the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. And he suggested in his critical pedagogy that in order to approach meaningful and relevant learning spaces, we needed to be able to engage in inquiry, in questioning, in probing, and reflecting. And I believe that as change agents, we will be required to rewire and re-engineer education, education that is now on a pathway of change and transformation. And in order to be able to be looking forward, I might say, in order to be able to engage as these transformative change agents, I want to suggest three elements or three concepts to keep in mind. The first is the idea of relevance. How do we continue to make education relevant for the new and younger generations? We as a population continue to evolve and change, and that sense of relevance, of being able to bring one's lived narrative into the classroom, whether it's a fifth grade classroom or a graduate program. How do we sustain and maintain the relevance of learning to our everyday lives? This job, I would suggest, will require that we heighten our level of comfort with this complexity. It is not about trying to simplify and quantify everything that happens in the classroom. It is the complexity of relationship building and sustained engagement. So, relevance is the first element that I'd like to introduce as we think about educational leadership and management. The second, in terms of transformative approaches in education, will require that we bring justice, equity, and dignity into that learning space. As our students, our emerging leaders redefine the purpose of leadership, they will also be challenged to redefine the purpose of their own education. This work will require deep listening and authentic dialogue. So, validation of a new perspective of education then emerges as an embodiment of practice where we align our vision, our theory, and take action. So, first relevance, then justice and equity. And the third element that I would like to introduce as we think about leadership in the field of education will be innovation and incubation. As we give birth to new ways of knowing and doing, this will require risk taking. It will require that we approach new ways of learning, innovative, and these innovative approaches can be messy, they can be challenging, and they will question the status quo. There will be resistance. But new ideas, new thoughts, new imagining is going to be required. This vision and hope for the future is palpable when working with students. They are the global leaders that we need. And yet we recognize that if we do nothing different, how can we expect them to take on new leadership? So part of our work as educators is not only to engage in the present moment, but also to have in mind that we are continuing to work with those that are emerging in the pipeline of leadership. So, to reimagine the role of education for social transformation will require uncloaking this current process that has confined many of us, not only as educators, but also our young learners. So, transformative education will require that we open these gates to new pathways. It will require human flourishing, that keeping in mind that this is our destination. So I want to invite us all to jump in and to engage, to listen attentively, and also to formulate your questions. The agenda for the coming hour is that we will engage our panelists, and I will introduce them to you in just a second. Each one will be able to share, and then we will have a very open dialogue with one another, raising questions, raising issues, thinking out loud together. After about 40 minutes of doing our discussion roundtable with the panelists, we will open the floor for questions from the audience, which we hope you will post in the chat. And that posting can happen even as we speak. So if a question comes to mind, please feel free to put it into the chat box. I love looking at who is on this launch. Well, that's my evening, but it could be your early morning. But we have individuals from South Africa, from the UAE, from Lithuania, from Rwanda, the UK. Very exciting to see all of you on from India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Kenya. Very fun, very fun. So thank you all so much for making the time and being willing to join. Please help me in welcoming our panelists for this launch. And I am going to start. I can't see who else is on, but I will start with the three that joined me at the very beginning. So let me first introduce Craig Fullerton. Craig Fullerton is an inspirational thought leader in integral education. He's an engaging storyteller, an author, inspirational coach, and international TED and keynote speaker. His approach is based on an integral model of learning that incorporates aspects of neuroscience, cognitive psychology, associative learning, and neuro-linguistic programming. Craig holds advanced degrees in educational leadership and management and is endorsed by many, but including the Global Institute of Organizational Neuroscience. Craig, thank you so much for joining us. Let me go on to introduce Susie Boss, who is based in Portland, Oregon, in the United States. Susie is an author and educational consultant and has worked with educators around the globe who are shifting from a teacher centered approach to student centered learning. She is the author of a dozen books, a longtime contributor to Edutopia, and her most recent book, Redefining Student Success, Building a New Vision to Transforming Leading, Teaching, and Learning. It focuses on how communities embrace new visions to prepare students for future challenge. Susie, welcome. And third, I'd like to introduce Roy Schwartzman. Roy is a full professor in the Department of Communication and co-director of Campus Writing and Speaking Program at North Carolina State University. He has published more than 150 scholarly articles and chapters and has won several national awards for research. He served as a department head from 2019 to 2023 and was awarded in 2022 a presidential citation for outstanding service to the discipline from the National Communication Association. So welcome to our panelists. And I see Craig and Roy are on, and I'm wondering if Susie was able to get back on. She had been on with us, but I don't see her on the screen at the moment. Well, there she is. Great. So now we've got Susie on as well. Excellent. So with that, what I'd like to do, and we may have a couple more presenters who join us, we're anticipating that there may be. So for now, what I'd like to do is ask each one of our panelists to take maybe 2 to 3 minutes and help us focus our attention. So educational leadership and management is very broad. And what I love is that each one of you has your area of specialty. And my guess is that with that area of specialty, we will be able to hear from you as to where you would suggest and encourage us to shine our light as we begin to address this topic that is presented in the 4th edition of .ed magazine. So, Craig, if you'd like to take a couple of minutes, help us shine our light, focus us. Where would you like to shine our light? And if you could just unmute Craig, that would be fabulous.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'll just fix that up. Yeah, I think part of what I talk about in the magazine, but also in my other work as well, is incorporating all the integral education models that you mentioned. And thank you for that wonderful introduction, Maria. It really gets down to one major thing, I think, in order for us to be great leaders in education and facilitators of education, is to think about something we probably don't think about enough because we're carried away with the routines and the logistics of what we do. And that is, are we in our roles in leadership reflecting our own values, our own core values? Does what we do resonate with who we are? Because if it doesn't resonate and you haven't actually taken time for self-discovery and to think about, why am I doing what I'm doing? What's the why in me being a leader? Not just the what and the how, we can all cover that. But if you're thinking about why am I doing what I'm doing, then you suddenly start to develop intrinsic motivational drivers. If it's resonating with your values, it's not about the plaque on the wall. It's not about the title in education leadership. It's about who you are and how you're able to reflect who you are and why you are and how you are in your role as a leader. Because once that coin drops and you start to realize, yes, I am reflecting what the way I approach things, my own values, then suddenly the world of education and you as a leader in that world, in that space, becomes an incredible, very exciting and enjoyable, even more enjoyable vocation, because you're intrinsically motivated, you're driven to do what you want to do the best you can do it, rather than just doing it because you can. I think that's the secret of it, having those values and knowing why I'm doing what I'm doing, rather than I'm doing it because I can.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Craig. I love the shining of that light on those core values and the why, as you posed it, the why. Susie, would love to hear from you next.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for this opportunity to connect. And Maria, I loved your introduction. As I was listening to you, I was jotting notes because so much was resonating with me with the work that I've been doing the last few years in particular. Finding out from leaders around the globe and across the U.S., how are they working with their communities to really reset the vision? You know, you talked about the importance of having a North Star. Well, what are we, where are we going? What is that North Star? Where are we aiming for? And the process that I'm very excited about is how communities and larger organizations in education are resetting that vision by really being active listeners, engaging everyone in their community, including students themselves, in really crafting a new vision, starting with a portrait of a student. What do we want our students to know and be able to do by the time they graduate? If we're really clear on that as a community, if we've brought our stakeholders in and gotten very crisp on that vision, then we can begin to engage in backwards planning, thinking about what are the actions that are going to get us there. And you use the phrase North Star. I think for communities that have gone through this process, whether it's at the local level, state level, or even more broadly, they have a North Star, and then they can begin to innovate toward that new vision. So it's not innovation for the sake of innovation, but very focused on how are we going to get to this vision so that our students really are ready and capable to create the future that they imagine and that they aspire to. So really delighted to be with all of you to talk more about all of this.
Thank you, Susie. And it complements Craig's words so well, right? If we have those values, if we have that sense of why, then we need to know, well, in what direction are we going?
Right. Where are we going?
Yeah. For you to be able to say, resetting that vision begins to chart the course. So thank you so much for that. Would love to hear your thoughts and your opening words.
First of all, again, I would like to thank everyone involved in getting this event organized, and particularly to appreciate the attendees from everywhere.
Let me stop you for a second. Can I ask Craig and Susie to mute yourselves? There's a lot of feedback coming on your Androids. I want to make sure we can all hear you. Let's try that again.
Okay. First, I just want to thank everyone involved in this event. And especially the attendees. One of the things I love about the Global Citizenship Foundation is it's an organization that actually does practice a worldwide focus to enable us to have a breadth of understanding and vision that I think is absent from a lot of associations, particularly scholarly organizations. What I have to say largely comes from the standpoint of a communication scholar. And I would like to kind of shine our light on a couple of things in the broader context of what my fellow panelists have talked about. As a communication scholar, I'm very interested in the language. My fundamental metaphor for leadership involves the idea of cultivation. And I deal with cultivation in a very straightforward sense, and that is the whole idea of enabling a flourishing of people on their own terms. What can leaders do to provide, encourage an environment where everyone can flourish in their own way, and collectively we can flourish in complementary ways? And to understand the roots of that, my focus is on resilience, which often, particularly throughout and after the pandemic, has emerged as something of a God term. What I try to do is deconstruct this by taking a look at really 4 different types of resilience. 3 are in the article, but 1 I'll add, and those are personal resilience, which we hear a lot about, usually in the context of developing grit, which I have some concerns about. We can get into that in the discussion. Also, there's community resilience, and a lot of that scholarship has focused on communities rebuilding after disasters. but I don't think that's a discrete type of resilience. I think that mentality can be encouraged by leaders in educational contexts and should be. Then there is relational resilience. This gets into the idea of restoring and invigorating the engagement piece that you've already heard about, and I think is going to play a big part in our discussion. And finally, there is something from the standpoint of particularly operating in a hyper-capitalist society, and that is institutional resilience. And I identify this as often a problematic attempt to return to the status quo and to resist change. We've already heard Paulo Freire invoked already, and I think we have to bear in mind that in encouraging resilience, we also are encouraging a productive form of resistance, resistance to passivity. And
Sorry for interrupting. So, Dr. Roy, I think there is some issue for your voice and microphone. Can you check it once again?
Okay. How's
Because,
it now?
yeah, it's still a bit muffled. Can you try if there is any audio device beside you and you can try and remove it if you are using it?
Okay.
Like headphones or...
No, I could try that. But
Okay.
anyway, I can make those technical adjustments while we move to the next stage of the program.
Okay.
All right. So sorry to have cut you off right there, Roy. But I love this idea of cultivation. How do we cultivate? How do we move towards flourishing? Right. So if resetting the vision is putting our sights forward and not backward, then how do we begin to advance? And Roy, as you suggested, it's that I love the concept of relational resilience. How do we begin to harness the value and the import of these relationships? So, given that we have a great starting point here, my question now is, what will it take? What will it require to begin to move forward? What will it take in order for us to be able to have that forward focus and that sense of hope that in fact change is possible? Thoughts, Craig?
Just unmuted. Yes, I think in moving forward, we need to identify that, as you mentioned earlier, coming out of the pandemic, for example, the whole world of education is very different. The whole way of engaging in teaching and learning is very different. And to take up Professor Roy's point about resilience, during the pandemic time, quite a few people reached out, and the problem was, or their concern was, that they couldn't get students of all ages to engage. And it's not their fault. They had the best operating systems, they had portals, platforms, and all those things. But what we discovered through some various webinars and things that I ran was that students now, and coming out of the pandemic, they want to be engaged, they want to be entertained. And without taking anything away from the teaching and learning, what came out of that conversation, or those conversations, was to look at different ways of presenting and engaging students in lessons, in engaging leaders in conversations. Flipped and blended learning is a term that's been around for a long time. Why do I mention that now? Because think of our leaders, think of our students. What are they looking for? They want, getting into the neuroscience side of things without getting too much into that, but they want the dopamine fix. They want to go on with serotonin buzzing around inside them. They want to be able to feel inspired. They want to be able to feel engaged. So therefore, by incorporating multimedia, for example, moving forward in teaching and learning, and not just relying on maybe a PowerPoint or a more teaching and learning. Okay, you might have to look at some PowerPoints. You might need to look at pairing and sharing. You might need to look at some videos that you can use. You might need to look at some games you can do online. You might need to look at these things, which does take more work. But to lead our students and lead our schools and universities through the 21st century, the second half of the 21st century, we need to understand that people learn differently than perhaps what they did before, and giving some credit for that difference through the pandemic, because as by way of example, to stand in front of a camera, which many people did at the start of the pandemic because they didn't know any different, to stand in front of the camera like we are now with a PPT behind them and expect the students to engage didn't work, because the students would, you'd see their photo. We all know the trick. You'd see their photo, but they weren't actually there. And that's because they wanted to be engaged. And what's the big thing about that going forward again is one word, and that is connection. Without the connection of the bodies, without the connection of the minds, getting the oxytocin moving, getting the dopamine moving, getting the serotonin moving amongst friends and amongst colleagues on a face-to-face, which they did do before COVID, and now we're doing it again after COVID, but we need to do it in a different way, because attention spans are less, from the research is showing us now, than what they perhaps were. Even whether you're 16 or you're 12 or you're 6 or you're 46 in a meeting, the attention spans need to be constantly stimulated. This thing needs to be working, needs to be having neurons firing off. And how to do that is, without getting scientific about it, is to look at the ways that we lead our staff, our colleagues and each other and our parents in looking at different ways of incorporating an intrinsically motivated leader, an intrinsically motivated student, to engage in ways that they will recall information, they will engage with the information, they will have inquiry into the information they're learning, which is very much now we are not, how can I put it, just to finish off the conversation in this space, we're not really teachers in the traditional sense. What we are facilitators of learning, which is a whole different beast. We're facilitators of learning in a staff meeting with our colleagues. We're facilitators of learning in a school improvement team. We're facilitators of learning in a class of 6th graders, in a class of 12th graders. We're not delivering the mail like a postman. We're not delivering curriculum. We're not delivering syllabi. That doesn't work anymore, because we've got this to think about and we've got this to think about. And that is all about engaging in learning. And it's an exciting time, but with the work I've done in neuroscience of learning, and I continue to do it for my PhD work as well, the whole way we learn is not difficult, but it's just different. And we were kind of reminded of that through COVID.
Thank you so much for that, Craig. Yeah, connecting head and heart. How do we do it? And how do we do it with these new generations? I'm going to ask you to mute yourself, Craig. You also raise a very important point, and while you didn't call them digital natives, younger generations are in fact digital natives in many parts of the planet. And if we're working with what used to be, I was just getting used to understanding Gen Z, and now I have to learn about Gen Alpha. Right now that's the next generation. And I think to myself, my goodness, I am several generations away from that. So how do I bridge that gap as an educator between a baby boomer generation? I use the typewriter. Now it's a novelty. It's something you would buy in a souvenir antique store, right? I mean, just the change in thinking and how our mindset. So yes, becoming these facilitators of learning will require a new type of embodiment in terms of leadership. So on that note, Susie, can I turn it over to you? How would you have us turn our attention to moving forward?
Right. Such great topics and themes emerging from all of you here. And Craig, when I hear you talk about engagement, of course, we know that's a foundation, right, for any kind of learning. If students aren't engaged, they're not, nothing's going to happen on the learning side. It may happen, there may be brief moments, but it's not going to be enduring. They're not going to have those enduring understandings. They're not going to get to the big ideas that are going to carry them forward. And so how do we make education more engaging? And for me, it comes back to the sense of students having a purpose, having a sense of why am I learning this? You know, any teacher has experienced or has heard that question from students. Why do I need to know this? When will I need to use this? And I think if students see the purpose for what they're learning, if they're very engaged, to use that word again, in driving toward purposeful learning. So if they're solving problems that matter to them, if they're getting out of the kind of silos of you're going to learn math over here and then language arts over here and maybe some social studies, if you're lucky, over here, instead of we're bringing those really important disciplines together to solve problems that students are going to want to engage in and solve, I think we get to a different experience where we do see students being willing to extend themselves, doing that, thinking right at the edge of their comfort level where we know deep learning is going to happen because it's not the easy, quick memorization, but it's really digging in and then trying to apply their understanding to do something with it, to solve a problem or to come up with, an innovative solution. And I think in schools that are in school systems that are moving in this direction, we're already seeing really wonderful evidence of what does this look like. This is not some sort of a blue sky, some future day this is going to happen. Along with looking at what are some new visions for education, we looked really hard to find what does that look like when it's happening. And we found amazing examples of students engaging with their communities in a very deep way to tackle problems from, climate change and how that's impacting their community, to inventions that they think are going to be world changing, to forms of civic engagement that really get at the idea of global citizenship, but from a local level, that local action toward global goals. So I think these opportunities are right there within our reach because we're seeing them already in schools that are moving toward these new visions and that are bringing their students along because their students are invited to participate in their education. It's not being done to them. They're very much partners in their education. So those are things I'm excited about.
Thank you, Susie. I'm reminded of Paulo Freire's words when he said, students are not empty vessels. They come to us with these lived experiences, which may be familiar, may not be familiar to us as those facilitators or educators in the classroom. And your point of this purposeful learning requiring relevance, right? If they come to us with their lived experiences, how do we make these connections so that sense of relevance and meaningfulness emerges? And yes, it will require these new models that you're suggesting. And it sounds like you have some great examples, and I hope we get to some of those.
I would love to talk with them. Talk about them. Very exciting.
Of when this has happened. And so now I'm going to ask Rory. Rory, what are your thoughts about moving forward? I love that earlier you had said, if it's about resilience, it's about that relational resilience, institutional resilience. What first steps are needed or what middle steps are needed for this work?
Well, apparently the first step is headphones or something like that. So hopefully everyone can hear me at this point. I think that the notion of resilience is built on some fundamental things that both Craig and Susie have suggested here. First of all, one of the things that cognitive neuroscience has taught us that's very important for education is that the heart leads the head. And that is that we engage students when we begin by deferring to them as to what matters to you. Now, many of our students aren't even ready for that yet, right? Because they might be very tentative. Maybe nobody's asked them that question. No one has deferred to them yet. So rather than just leave the space open for that, I think part of what we need to do as far as resilience entering the picture is paradoxically actually actually encourage an atmosphere where perseverance comes into play. What this means, and here's the paradox, is embracing the concept of failure. And this is failure not as some sort of a personal shortcoming, but failure often as the result of what makes us human, namely exploration and experimentation. And to fuel an environment, I see my voice stuff isn't coming through. Are people hearing me? Because I've done everything I can do.
We can hear you, but it's very raspy. So I don't know what else to suggest. I mean,
maybe that's maybe I have a nice new vocal quality. Let's see. Okay, is this any better?
No, but it is understandable. I mean, it just sounds like there's a big machine next to you as you speak. But I know. But
anyway,
please.
But yeah, as long as I'm reasonably understandable. Which is often how my students describe it. But the idea here is that we need to figure out how perseverance can be encouraged. And part of that is experimenting with different tools for engagement. And here is the big elephant in the room, so to speak, that has emerged since all of us sent in our contributions to .ed magazine, and that is the role of AI, and using that as a tool to really ramp up engagement, right? The use of AI basically as an assistant to do one's work for you is a tool of disengagement. So I think part of the question we have to ask is, how does this enter the picture? We know it is a tool that essentially is becoming ubiquitous. And we need to bear in mind that simply because our students are digital natives does not necessarily mean that they've already developed or are ready to develop transferable skills across different types of technologies and platforms. So I think a big piece of what we're dealing with in encouraging engagement and in building the readiness to build relationships once again is to understand how to utilize this new and powerful tool that's at our disposal.
Well said, Roy. This idea that AI, in fact, could be a blessing and a curse. Is it, if it's viewed as a tool of disengagement? It defeats that relationship building and that connection of heart and head that we had been wanting to explore. Thank you for bringing up the topic of perseverance. How do we continue to persevere even in the face of failure? And what we know is that we have to fail many times before we can break through and continue to advance. That failure is not without its merit. And so it becomes very difficult, as you suggest, this paradox of what's possible, and yet there is so much pressure in some educational systems to achieve your rank, to get that score, and the pushing forward of our educational leaders in the classroom. They are caught between a rock and a hard space, right? How do we continue to support them? I also recognize that we are preparing learners for a world that we have not yet seen. You mentioned, Roy, that in 12 months, everything around AI turned upside down and inside out for many of us, for everyone. Although I say many because not everyone wants to connect to it or engage with it. Although it is rapidly changing the platform of learning, of daily life, of the future workforce. And so, as we think about the incredibly rapid pace of change, looking again forward, how do we prepare for that? What other words of advice would you provide for us? Because again, educational leadership requires those individuals, whether they're facilitators or they're the change agents. Educational leadership requires someone to be guiding the process of learning. And how will we attend to the needs of those individuals? What is it that our teachers, our facilitators are going to need to be able to do this transformative work? Craig, any thoughts?
A really good point. And my thoughts on the matter is really that in moving forward, you need to be moving forward and be motivated to move forward in yourself as a leader, because change, as you say, is very, very fast. And what ways we can do that, we can think about that, is to, as leaders, and I mean, everybody in the classroom is a leader. They're teachers as leaders, principals as leaders. You know, we are all leaders, and we need to lead the change to support each other and to support our students. So I think we, rather than kind of thinking, oh, well, I'll ignore it, or it doesn't really apply to me, those kind of throwaway kind of phrases, as leaders, we need to be proactive in seeing and learning ourselves about what these things, these different technologies can do. And getting back to my point earlier when I talked about neuroscience and education, or neuroeducation as I call it, that's a big part of it, because AI is a tool, the same as a synthesizer is a tool. A software program to compose music is a tool. AI is a tool, but you still need to know what to put into that tool to get the best use of it in education, the best use of it to engage learners. And that goes back to also to when I did Head and Heart before, is teachers being more and more, leaders being and teachers being more and more proactive, I think, in really trying to investigate how the brain learns and why the brain learns in a certain way. Because if you go way back to that and you think, all right, so this is how an adolescent brain learns. This is how an adult brain learns. To getting a little bit of, I'm not saying to all go out and do degrees in neuroscience, but to get a background in how the brain learns. You mentioned mindset earlier, Maria, and the same thing. What is a growth mindset? What is a fixed mindset? These are terms that have been around for a long time. But all of us as leaders in schools and universities and things, do we or have we really investigated? Like Carol Dweck's work, have we really investigated what is a growth mindset? How does that reflect on how the brain learns? How then do those two things hook together? So a growth mindset, or let's say mindset, and how the brain learns, how does that then continue a circle of a learning cycle? And then as we go through that learning cycle, what are the tools like AI, and how do they reflect this? And how can we utilize those to get the circle keeps going? How the brain learns, why the brain learns, what the growth mindset's about. Okay, how can we use these tools, AI as one of them, to really reflect on that background knowledge? So as I say, it's just taking a bit of research and a bit of wonder of how all these things work, rather than just saying, oh, AI, let's try it and see what happens. But if you don't know why you're trying it, except on a very superficial level, when it first came out, oh, what can it do? I'll put in an idea and it'll bounce me back an essay or whatever. And of course, you can tell, and you still can tell it's AI. It's not. There's no personal input into it. Like when a composer sits down with software and knows nothing about it, and they drag a note here and drag a rest there and drag an instrument here and say, there it is. But it sounds electronic. It sounds like there's no soul in it. There's no head and heart in it, because they're just using the tool. I know I'm trying to use it as an analogy or as a metaphor, really, in a whole circle of learning, a whole cycle of learning. It starts here and here. And then on the way, in the future, we're going to see a lot of tools. We're going to see lots of versions of AI. We're going to see other things. We're going to see more about neurons, and we're going to see a lot more of these things. So as leaders, let's lead by example, and let's find out about these things. Thinking, when we get up in the morning, what can we wonder about today in the area of leadership? What can we wonder about today moving forward? So that's just some general thoughts on that whole piece about moving forward.
Thank you so much. I'll ask you to mute again. And I love this idea, the closing note. What can we wonder about? What can we be curious about? And how do we move forward? So with that in mind, Susie, I'm very curious, what will we need in terms of educational leadership? What words of advice can you direct us towards?
I don't know if it's advice, but what I have observed from interviewing, a couple of hundred leaders who are doing this work of really resetting the vision and moving toward it. One of the themes that came up in our conversations, and I would say that the research for this book and the article that it's based on in the journal, we did all of our research during COVID. So educational leaders were just in the throes of, rapid change, unanticipated problems, having to shift overnight, having to pivot without any plan. And those school systems that seemed better able to manage change and to move forward in a way that was supportive of their students and their communities had put some work already into building a collaborative relationship with their staff. So they had relationships as leaders. They had built those relationships within their adult community. So the adults in the school system had a sense of being able to trust each other, to work together, to try ideas, because they had leaders who said, we're not looking for perfection. We're looking for ideas toward, moving in this direction. And the phrase that we heard over and over again from educators, from teachers who were doing really remarkable things, both during COVID and since, they would use this term that, well, our leaders give us a green light. Our school head gives us a green light to innovate if we can explain what it is that we're trying to accomplish. It doesn't mean that they want us to be perfect, but it means that they want us to try things, and we have that not just permission. It's not about sort of top-down permission, but that sense of engagement ourselves, that we have the capacity to come up with new ideas and know that we can move forward with them as long as they are within the vision that we've all agreed is, we're moving in this direction. If we've got new ideas that might be helpful, let's try them, let's see, and prototype them, and then evaluate. Did they work? Didn't they work? What did we learn from these? This is, I think, the big message that our students really benefit from hearing, that a lot of our advances in society happen because we've tried things and evaluated whether they worked or not. I mean, the whole field of science, looks at data from experiments, and it's not always positive, right? You don't always get your hypothesis isn't always proven true. So I think educators having that sense that we can try things as long as they're kind of within these, there are some guardrails, we're not just in the Wild West here of let's try something new every day, but we're going to be thoughtful about this. And then we're going to evaluate, did this work? Was this successful or not? Would we do this again? Would we improve it? And then sharing that message with our students that, it's not about perfection. It's about the process of learning. And, we see examples in classrooms where teachers really embrace this concept, the growth mindset, for example, walking into an early elementary classroom where a big poster on the wall that students made was just the word yet, Y-E-T. And they referred to that over and over again. We're not there yet. We're going to keep working toward whatever it is, mastery of a concept or solving a problem. We're not going to be perfect the first time because that's not how we learn. That's not how we do things. We're going to go through the process of learning, and eventually we're going to get there. We're not there yet, but we're moving in that direction. So for me, seeing that in an elementary classroom was a good signal. This is a teacher who really gets it and who is inspiring students to realize, we learn through this process and it's cyclical, and we're going to keep at it until we get to the goals that we think are important and that we all value in our community of learners. So just a few random thoughts there.
Well said, Susie, and thank you for sharing that example of yet. That's going to stick with me. I love that. Well, you also began to approach the idea of the school culture or the organizational culture. And so, Roy, you had also mentioned earlier the institution. So how can educational leaders be purposeful in creating that organizational culture and in trying to guide that consistency of culture?
Okay, I'm back with hopefully upgraded sound settings. Okay, I've well, this is my technical issues are exactly what we're talking about, though, right? Because I think this is the sort of thing that we need to encourage as leaders, and that is to constantly encourage human agency to conduct ongoing experiments, ongoing explorations. I would add to that, I think Carol Dweck herself actually uses that example of the poster. And I would add that a healthy attitude to cultivate is every claim, every statement shouldn't end with a period or something like that. It should either end in a question mark or ellipses, that there is space for adjustment. There is space for further contribution. So I think that leaders can really take the advice of Socrates, remembering that now Socrates didn't know a whole lot about neuroscience, but a lot of Socrates' comments apply very well. And that is that the love of learning begins with wonder, right? So, students, and I might add, we've talked about student engagement a lot. I'd like to add in there instructor engagement as well, right? Because one of the things that can affect educational quality is the phenomenon that I have witnessed quite a bit during the pandemic, and it's persisted afterwards, is various forms of quiet quitting and disengagement from the instructor side. Some of this is reflected in some of the attitudes about AI, for instance. It's rather disturbing that among the many AI groups that I'm a member of online, there is still a lot of mentality of kind of a gatekeeper or enforcer attitude. How do I catch people who are using this tool to cheat? And it's like, well, I mean, part of the answer to that is experimentation on the instructional side. I think too often, not only in the classroom, but in our reward system and in our performance evaluations, things like this, that we also value product over process. How many finished things can you produce, right? How many beans can you count? But really, I think a huge part of productive leadership is to embrace the significance of honing processes, and that there is, and this is, of course, part of a growth mindset as well, and that is that there is value in incremental steps. There is value in simply seeing more options, and not necessarily saying that you have to have a fully polished product every time, or that it has to be perfect. And of course, we can get into the literature and perfectionism as well. So oddly enough, I think we need to rehabilitate this notion of failure that's not a personal shortcoming. The idea of incompletion as something that isn't just not doing something, that maybe we don't want to overclaim, right? And so that is those are some pieces of leadership that you often don't hear about, but I think it does require some of what Craig was talking about, which is a transformation of the core values involved in leadership.
Thank you, Roy. And I'm going to then, with that note, turn back to Craig and ask you about values-based leadership. You began our panel talking about the role of values and reflecting our own core values. Can you say something about values-based leadership, and how does it intersect with AI technology or more global collaboration in education?
With values-based leadership, I think you really need to take yourself for a minute out of the role you have as a leader and go into your own self-discovery and identify, it might be 30 values. You might just go there, just start writing them all down. And then from those, let's say 20 values of what you value, it might be one word answers like caring or autonomy, whatever it might be, as a person. Because when you go into your leadership role, it's still you going into it. It's not another person. So identifying your own values through some self-discovery, which doesn't take long, it's quite fun to do, just to go through and say, right, I'm going to come up with 20. You own it, be empowered yourself. I'm going to come up with 20 of my values. You might start off with a list of 30, and then you go to 20, and then you give yourself a little test. You say, right, now I'm going to go with 10 values. Right, of those 10 values, now I'm going to put on my leader's hat. Of those 10 values, what are my top 5 values that I take to work every day? And then you've got those 5. Then you really start to understand why you do, why you react, why you work the way you work. And then from, let's say, those top 5 values that you take to work with you in your career every day, I ask you to then go to, it's tough, go for 3. What are your top 3 values as a leader? Now, I'm not saying put in a label, I am head of department, or I am a principal, or I'm a CEO. No, what are your top 3 values as a leader? And where I'm getting at here is that once you've identified that, you can really start to see and understand why you function a certain way, or alternatively, why you don't function a certain other way. Because you've said, well, this is me. I'm very comfortable that this is me. But then how do you function in your role? And we're still talking about career values here now. How do you function in your role that resonates those 3 values? And you might find a whole other list goes on, and you think, well, really, of those 10, 8 of them, 7 of them, 6 of them, it's really not me. I'm doing it because I can. So as global leaders, as global citizens, leading by example, leading your colleagues, leading your schools, leading your students, you really need to know who you are. You really need to know why you are who you are, because then you will find that a lot of things will start to, I always say, if you identify the why, the how will start to appear. And you may change positively as a leader because you start to really identify who and why you are. And then you're going to be an amazing leader because you're going to take yourself holistically, head and heart, and holistically into your role. It's not going to be a remit as such. It's going to be you taking yourself into that role. And I think moving forward therefore, you will enjoy your leadership, you will enjoy you, and others will see that because you'll have this, I'll go use the term again, you'll have this intrinsic motivational wonder and glow about you because you really are confident with who you are. And why you're doing what you're doing. And then looking at AI, if you know who you are, then you start to look at AI, you start to look at different modalities and different technologies from a different angle, because it also needs to resonate with you as a leader. It also needs to resonate with what you're doing and why you're doing it. Because if you're really confident and you really start to know who you are, you're going to see this, let's say AI or this technology, and you're going to see this one and this one and this one, and you're going to say, well, hold on, these two, it's not really me, but these ones, I could really use these in my school. I could really use these in my meetings simply because it's resonating with who you are.
That's
and moving
correct.
forward, global leaders and global citizens and global leaders, it's an aha moment once you know why you're doing what you're doing.
Thank you, Craig. Very well said. Thank you for addressing values leadership. I actually have been taking some questions off of the the Q&A box already. And now for a third question, because you just answered the values-based question, Craig. I want to ask Susie about engaging community. One of the questions talked about or asked the question, how can educational institutions create a more inclusive and welcoming environment, specifically for LGBTQ individuals, in order to promote diversity and understanding within the education community? Your thoughts on that question, Susie?
Yes, and I think this is where one of those whoops. Yep, we're all still, sorry, my screen just changed, caught my attention there. Novelty, right? Gets our attention. It's a great question. And I think broadly, it's about as leaders having the capacity to be active listeners, to be people who invite everyone into the conversation about what is school about, how do we make everyone comfortable here, how do we learn together. And in the stakeholder conversations that I've been describing, and the work that I've been talking about in terms of setting a new vision, one of the big questions for leaders is who needs to be part of that conversation, and how are you going to ensure that voices perhaps who haven't been heard from in the past are going to be part of the conversation going forward. So knowing who perhaps you're not yet engaging, how can you reach out to populations who aren't being heard? You may need to broker some new relationships, find some new allies in communities that aren't feeling represented, in ensuring that they have safe spaces to talk about what is it that they need in education, what do they value, what are they looking for, what are their hopes and dreams about the graduates that they want to become, and the what they want to be able to do and accomplish, and how education is going to prepare them for that. So I think thinking really broadly about stakeholders, who are all of our populations, how do we start to bring leaders from all of those different groups together into really productive discussions that, again, are safe spaces for people to share what matters to them. And if there are populations you're not hearing from as a leader, that's a hard question. Who am I not hearing from? But it does inquire, asking that question, again, going back to that sense of wonder, doing some, different kinds of outreach than perhaps you've done before. The question was specifically about our LGBTQ, populations who really need to be listened to and to be heard. In some of our community conversations that we learned about, leaders were very good about taking the conversations into the community. So taking them out, breaking the school walls, going out to community groups. One community leader had 100 conversations around his small rural and high poverty community, providing things like meals for families, providing translation so that people could speak in their first language and didn't have to feel like they weren't part of the conversation. So thinking about what are the barriers to engaging people we're not hearing from now? How can we break those barriers? How can we find some allies in each of those communities to come forward and work with us to be better at listening and at hearing the issues that we really need to hear from? So those are a few of the strategies that we heard that seem to really work well and lead to deeper, richer, more productive conversations. Not easy conversations, but certainly more productive. And it requires some skilled leadership, certainly, to broker those, open those conversations, have really productive but not always easy conversations, and then help your community, your broader community, reach some commonalities, find some consensus points. What can we work on together? How can we move forward together?
Exactly. So shared interests.
That question of who am I not hearing from? Who am I not listening to? How do I find that out? And then how do I, start to bridge that and start to, have those dialogues that I need to be having.
And those are great examples of inclusive leadership, to be able to have that level of engagement. Danielle asked the question about disruption. And she said, the state of education has been, in upheaval for a while. Why do you think and this question is for you, Roy. What do you think prevented these disruptions and reforms earlier?
Yeah, I think that this squarely takes us to this notion of institutional resilience in the ways that I have engaged with this. And in fact, I will drop in the chat the URL to my website because I have full texts of these articles there. You know, part of the issue we're looking at here is that there is a great deal of inertia in education and resistance to change. I mean, the long running joke, particularly in higher education, that's not really a joke, but it's a fairly accurate statement, is that the pace of change is glacial at best. I think a lot of what has happened is that we have not thoroughly challenged the notion and practice leadership as something other than hierarchical. Okay. And that what we have to continue to do is for people in positions of formal institutional leadership who are primarily the policy makers, that they can also be the policy changers, and that we need to continue to hold leaders accountable and also to share in that accountability, to work with policymakers to say, okay, resistance is not just a matter of saying no to everything, but it's a resistance to simply failing to take advantage of opportunities. And I think too often in education, we tend to be in the mindset of crisis management rather than embracing opportunities for growth and change. So I think here on the larger institutional sense, it is something along the lines of transforming into more of a growth mindset, that there are opportunities, and hopefully that doesn't require something as cataclysmic as a global pandemic to lead us into. And I think one of the tricks too in being an effective leader in these conditions and to help to nourish an environment for change is, for example, even in classrooms, I'm firmly embrace the idea of, I don't really like the war metaphors that much, but I mean, I think in this case, it's kind of instructive. Get in the trenches with students. And, you know, if you have people in formal leadership positions who are making problematic decisions, yes, resist, but also constructively engage. Right? There are opportunities for us all to engage in these practices beyond our own classrooms and to say that we can be partners in change as well as simply regressing to the way things were before. And the question that I have asked in some of my recent work that is kind of designed as a challenge related to educational leadership is, what have we learned that we can implement from the pandemic?
Absolutely. And so we only have a few minutes left. I'm going to toss this question out. Standard vision, and it was Isha's question, standard vision of student success versus personalized learning directed towards individual student interests. How do we balance that, Craig? How do we balance between the standardized vision, get those scores up, meet those right academic achievement levels versus individual student interests? How do we balance that? Quick thoughts?
Quick thoughts. Well, to start with, the student needs to be self-empowered to be interested in what they're learning. It can't just be about standardized tests. Yeah, so what am I learning about? Why am I learning it? Again, it gets back to the why. But by engaging students in different ways, engaging students, engaging a topic and engaging students in different ways, then hopefully they can also, as we talked about with leadership throughout the evening, they can also be intrinsically motivated to want to learn. And then when they want to learn, that is personalized learning, but it also is going to have a default, if you will, toward the standardized tests and the vision and so on and so forth. Because they're wanting to learn, they've got recall, they're wanting to do what you've asked them to do, because they have owned, they own it, they embrace it, they want to learn about it. So I think the balance is empowering students to own their learning, for the instructor to differentiate and different ways of engaging students in the teaching and learning. And by putting these two things together, they're enjoying what they're learning, you're enjoying what you're learning, what you're teaching, you're differentiating, students are owning it, students are empowered by it, they're going to want to learn it, they're learning personalized because they're owning it, but then that's also going to have a default, I'm sure, because they're enjoying it, into these standardized tests.
Thank you, Craig. And I know I'm putting you under the spotlight, but just asking for a quick answer. I'm going to throw the very first question out to you. The very first question of the evening was, what do you do if the educational leaders aren't qualified to lead? That's a big question. What do you do then?
You need to be able to have them also own their learning. The question, they're not qualified to lead. What does qualified to lead mean? Does qualified to lead mean it could be a whole range of things? But it's a very good question, and I took a little bit to be self-empowered, to identify their why, to take ownership of their learning, in order for them to know themselves, go back to the values again, and then lead by example, lead confidently, because they've done all this prep along the way. They're empowered, they own it, they know why they're doing it, therefore they're confident and knowledgeable in how to lead, and hopefully you won't have that quote unquote problem because they're across it as leaders. That's very much dot point thinking, Maria, but I think that's again, it's a formula. They need to own it, be empowered by it, know who they are, why they're doing what they're doing, why they're leading the way they're leading, and knowing who they are.
All right, thank you. And now with Susie, I'd love to ask you, one of the questions that came up is, how do you envision the role, this is Sahityas, how do you envision the role of traditional schools and colleges evolving in a future where online education provides greater freedom for students?
Wow, this is the question of the moment, isn't it? I mean, we've seen this big pivot, and that students are able to learn more when they want, where they want, how they want. They have many more choices of how they're going to be pursuing their education. So I think that the challenge for traditional schools and colleges is to think about, how do we meet the needs of our students in different ways than we have in the past? We don't need to have them all in the same classroom, all at the same time, following the same timetable toward the same learning goals with the same standardized outcomes. We can break that mold because we have different ways to structure the learning experience in terms of time and place, and it should also carry over to content and assessment. How are we giving students voice around what it is that they want to learn? How are we enabling them to show evidence of their learning and their mastery of really important learning goals? Doesn't always have to look the same way. But for institutions, this means being willing to take a hard look at some of our hardest to change practices, like grading, for example, and class ranks and grade point averages and standardized test scores. If those aren't the best measure of what students are capable of, what different measures are there? So are we moving more toward portfolio-based assessments where students can personalize? Here's evidence of who I am as a learner. Let me share that with you. Let me tell you the story of deep learning that I've experienced. Well, that's a different conversation than here's my transcript, here are my scores. So I think we have to be willing to start moving in that direction. And again, some schools are already moving in that direction. The challenge then is, let's say a K-12 system perhaps is moving toward mastery-based learning and, different sorts of performance assessments and portfolios. But what do they do when they want to pursue higher education? How will their results of learning be received, by colleges that they're applying to? So that conversation has to permeate our whole system. And I think that's going to take some time and some, it's not going to happen overnight. Certainly, these are long-held traditions of how we assess and how we talk about our successes as learners. But I think that's a conversation that's very ripe for change. And again, change is already happening. I suspect it's going to accelerate as we have more and more students learning online and in different ways.
Yes. And Roy, I'm going to give you the last question. It was posed by Lillian, and I think it was in response to your earlier comments. Who are the power brokers? Who are the power brokers that are holding on to the present state of education and make it hard to control?
Well, I think to some degree that depends on the governing structures in the particular educational system you're operating in. But I mean, for example, in the state of North Carolina, the state legislature, for example, is overtly hostile toward transgender people. And so, if you Google North Carolina bathroom law, you'll see how far that goes. Literally passing legislation dictating which bathrooms people can use, directed especially at transgender people. I think maybe I'd like to redirect the question a little bit, if that isn't cheating, and that is that the power brokers are going to differ somewhat, and they're not necessarily always the people who hold the highest level titles at an institution or a governing body. I think what we need to focus on is what our realm of control and influence is. For example, if you do have leaders at an organization who I think the term that was used is like unqualified or something like that. But if you're not getting a lot of leverage with change, let's say at the institution level, then maybe focus on what is within your sphere of control to change. Again, it kind of gets back to this notion we were talking about with students. It's a notion of agency and empowerment. And maybe that extends to your own classrooms. Well, that's a start, because those practices that you were instituting can then influence other educators. Okay, so I would say it doesn't necessarily have to be a top-down approach to change, but it can be change that's incremental in small areas that then expands.
I love that. Thank you so much, Roy. And with that, I want to give a heartfelt thank you to Roy, Craig, Susie. There were lots of questions. We tackled almost half of them, and I really appreciate that. I appreciate the perspectives that you brought. Educational leadership and management is evolving. It's evolving because education is evolving. And I very much appreciated that each one of you brought to the forefront that during this time of immense change and intense change, that there are some non-negotiables that we need to hold on to. Craig, you kicked it off by reminding us we need to hold on to those values, those core values. Who are we? What do we stand for? And what matters? What matters to us? And that will shape not only our work within the learning space, but our leadership. Then, Susie, you began and you continued the theme of really being able to focus on how we engage community, how we listen deeply in order to be able to craft and co-create a shared vision. That in the absence of that, someone will be left out, someone will not be seen. And you stressed and brought to the forefront how important it is to ask, who's missing? Whose voice have we not heard? And that then takes us to Roy's comments. And Roy, you helped us think about, how do we cultivate a forum for flourishing? How do we move forward in thinking about resilience and a new way of being able to fail for the good, fail for the greater good, because that's going to allow us to continue to persevere, to continue to engage, and to be able to understand that we, in fact, are preparing students for a future that we have not yet seen. And in order to do that, we have to be able to cultivate leadership that has this growth mindset, that engages us not only individually, but within community in order to be able to move forward. So with that, I'm going to be handing it back off to Yang, I believe, in order to bring us to a close. But again, thank you very much. Craig, Susie, Roy, thank you. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. And so Yang, there you are.
Yes. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending today's launch event. And now we will be playing the launching video of this magazine. Thank you.